It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon on the edge of town, the kind where time seems to slow down and life feels a little more peaceful. But for James Walker, a black Vietnam veteran in his late 70s, this day was about to take a turn he couldn't have anticipated or prepared for. James, with his weathered hands and slow, deliberate movements, had always commanded respect in his neighborhood, even among those who didn't know the full depth of his story. He was a man of quiet dignity, someone who carried his history like a badge, even if he rarely spoke about it. That afternoon, James had pulled into the parking lot of a small local grocery store. His old truck, the kind you'd call a relic of simpler times, creaked to a stop in a shaded corner. He wasn't in any rush. He never was these days. Adjusting his baseball cap, the one stitched with the insignia of his army unit from decades, he stepped out of the truck with the kind of careful grace that hinted at old injuries. He had come to pick up a few things: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, maybe some fresh fruit if the store had any worth buying. James didn't notice the patrol car at first. He didn't catch the way it had slowed as it passed by the parking lot, how it circled back like a predator catching sight of vulnerable prey. Inside, 2 police officers sat silently, their gazes fixed on the older man who was now leaning on his cane near the store entrance. To James, the routine of his day felt ordinary. To them, however, it seemed suspicious. What happened next unfolded quickly, but in that slow, sinking way that makes you feel the weight of every single moment. The officers exited their car, their uniforms crisp under the afternoon sun, and began approaching James with purpose. At first, he noticed them out of the corner of his eye, but even then, it didn't occur to him what was coming. After all, this was his town. He had lived here for years. He had served his country with honor, spilled blood for the freedoms these very officers claimed to protect. James didn't flinch as they drew closer. He had faced far worse in his lifetime. The lead officer, a man in his 30s with a tightened jaw and mirrored sunglasses, spoke first. His tone was sharp, almost rehearsed, as if he had already decided the nature of this interaction. "Sir, can we talk to you for a minute?" he called out, his hand casually resting on his belt, the gesture unmistakable. James turned toward them, his expression neutral but alert. "What seems to be the problem, officers?" His voice, deepened with age but steady, carried no trace of anger, only curiosity. The second officer, younger and noticeably less composed than the first, quickly jumped in. "This is a high-theft area. We just wanted to make sure everything's—" "Okay, that's all." James raised an eyebrow. "High-theft area? Was that why they were here? Was that why they wanted to speak with him? A 70-year-old man who could barely walk without his cane?" He leaned on it now, trying to measure their intentions. "I'm just here to buy some groceries," he said plainly. The lead officer wasn't convinced. "Mind showing us some ID?" The request was simple on the surface, something they'd likely ask anyone. But James hesitated. It wasn't the question itself. It was the way the officer said it, the tone embedded with something more than authority. It was distrust. Now the people in the parking lot began to take notice. A few heads turned. Conversations quieted as shoppers slowed down to observe the scene unfolding in front of the grocery store. Some pulled out their phones, capturing the officers' postures, the way they watched James as if he might bolt at any second. But James stood his ground, his chin lifted just slightly, a small but powerful gesture of defiance. "I don't see why my ID is necessary," he said firmly, his own voice beginning to harden. "Have I done something wrong?" The tension in the air thickened. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. Meanwhile, James kept his eyes on them, unwavering. Not intimidated, not confrontational, simply steady. And yet it was clear the officers weren't used to this kind of calm resistance. Perhaps they expected stammers, apologies, fear. But James had spent too much of his life facing far worse battles to crumble now. "I'm not here to argue with you, sir," the lead officer pressed, his tone just shy of condescending. "We're just doing our job. Now if you'd show us your ID—" "That's enough," James interrupted. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. His shoulders, though bent with age, squared just slightly. For the first time, there was a visible shift in his demeanor. The audience in the parking lot stirred, whispering to each other, wondering whether things would escalate, wondering whether this man who looked like he'd seen decades of storms would give in or stand taller. But it wasn't just the crowd paying attention anymore. From a distance, another figure was approaching, unnoticed by the officers as they continued their increasingly tense exchange with James. His pace was deliberate, each step carrying an energy that seemed to ripple through the atmosphere like an oncoming storm. He was younger than James, broad-shouldered and stoic, with an air of quiet authority that could fill a room. There was an intensity in his eyes, the kind that could disarm without saying a word, or so the people in the crowd would later describe. What neither the officers nor anyone else knew in that moment was that the man walking toward them, closing the gap with quiet precision, was not just James's son. He wasn't just a bystander who had coincidentally arrived to intervene. This was Major Samuel Walker, a name whispered in certain military circles with awe, respect, and even fear. The deadliest Delta Force commander in history. His reputation was the stuff of legends. And if James carried the quiet dignity of a decorated veteran, Samuel carried the unshakable poise of a man who had stood on countless battlefields and walked away unbroken. But the officers had no idea. They didn't even see him coming until he was almost upon them. Some in the crowd would later say they felt a shift, the kind of shift you can't explain but everyone around you feels. Almost as if the air itself braced for impact. Samuel didn't raise his voice. He didn't charge in with theatrics or threats. He simply stepped to his father's side and placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. And then he spoke. Is there a reason my father is standing here explaining himself to you? His tone was measured, polite even, but laced with something colder, something that made both officers instinctively bristle. The next move was theirs, but no one could predict what would come next. Not the crowd, not the officers, and perhaps not even James, who glanced at his son with an unreadable mix of gratitude and forewarning. Whatever happened from here, one thing was clear. Everything was about to change. The officers exchanged a glance, their confidence flickering for a moment as they absorbed Samuel's words. His presence was undeniable, and though his tone was calm, there was something in it that demanded attention, a quiet authority that made you think twice before answering casually. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but the older one wasn't ready to back down yet. He straightened his stance and met Samuel's eyes, though his mirrored sunglasses made it harder to tell just how rattled he was. Your father was acting suspiciously, the lead officer said, his voice steady but lacking the edge it had carried earlier. We're just making sure everything checks out here. Samuel tilted his head slightly, studying the officer with a level of scrutiny that seemed to strip away the layers of pretense. Suspiciously, he repeated, as if the word itself was somehow baffling. His gaze didn't waver, and the officer shifted just enough for it to be noticeable. James, who had remained quiet since Samuel's arrival, finally spoke, his voice cutting through the charged air. Samuel, it's fine, I don't need... But Samuel raised a hand, a subtle gesture that was more reassuring than dismissive. James fell silent, reluctant but trusting. I'd like to hear what exactly seemed suspicious, Samuel said, his voice light but laced with a firmness that left no room for evasion. Was it the groceries, the cane, or the hat that says he served his country? The lead officer took a small step back, though he tried to make it look casual, like he was just adjusting his stance. The younger officer avoided Samuel's eyes altogether, instead glancing at his partner for guidance. The crowd was quiet now, completely absorbed in the unfolding scene. Some whispered to each other, speculating about who this man might be to speak with such confidence, while others simply waited, their phones still recording. Look, the lead officer began after a pause, his tone softening just enough to signal that he was rethinking his approach. We're just doing our jobs, okay? It's our duty to make sure nothing's out of the ordinary. And harassing an elderly man in a parking lot is part of that duty? Samuel asked. the weight of his words pressing the question into the air. His expression gave nothing away, but his presence alone seemed to take up the space around him. The officer had no immediate answer. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and for the first time, the louder murmurs of the gathered onlookers began to fill the space. They weren't subtle anymore, openly voicing their disapproval. "Leave the guy alone," someone called out. "This is his town too," another voice added, gaining nods from those nearby. The tension between Samuel and the officers remained thick, but then James, who had been watching everything unfold, made a small move forward, leaning on his cane as he addressed the crowd. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But I'd rather we not turn this into a spectacle." The murmurs quieted. James looked at Samuel, his gaze a mixture of gratitude and something heavier, something unspoken. Samuel's expression softened slightly, sensing his father's unease. He knew better than most what James had endured in his life, the obstacles that had shaped him, the battles that had scarred him. And he knew it wasn't just about what was happening now, it was about everything this moment represented. The officers, perhaps sensing the momentum slipping out of their control, seemed uncertain about whether to press on or cut their losses. Finally, the lead officer cleared his throat. "We didn't mean any disrespect, sir," he said, addressing James directly this time. "You're free to go." James nodded, his face impassive but his eyes betraying the exhaustion of the ordeal. Samuel, however, didn't move. He stood still, his eyes locked onto the officers as they grudgingly retreated to their car. Even as they drove away, he didn't relax. His posture remained rigid, his jaw tight, until they were completely out of sight. When it was finally just the two of them, Samuel turned to his father. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice no longer carrying the cutting sharpness it had moments before. James nodded again, but this time his shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the moment catching up to him. "I'm fine," he said, though Samuel wasn't entirely convinced. There was a long pause as the two stood there, surrounded by the dissipating crowd. Samuel finally broke the silence. "You couldn't call me before it got to this?" he asked, his tone more teasing than accusatory. "I'm losing my touch if you had to handle them on your own." James chuckled, a deep, warm sound that carried years of wisdom and a hint of weariness. "You think I'm going to call my boy to come babysit me every time life throws something my way? Who do you think raised you to be able to do what you do?" Samuel couldn't help but smile at that, a rare, genuine expression that softened his otherwise steely demeanor. But there was still a heaviness in the air, unspoken feelings that neither father nor son seemed ready to address in full. The two began making their way toward the truck, Samuel walking slightly behind his father, his eyes scanning the area, as a reflex. His mind was racing, about the officers, the crowd, and most of all about James. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Ever since he was a boy, Samuel had watched his father face the world with a quiet resilience that often made him stand out in ways he didn't intend or deserve. While he'd grown up respecting James as a man and a father, it wasn't until years later, when Samuel had joined the army and begun his own military career, that he truly understood just how remarkable his father was. James had never boasted about his service, never demanded recognition for the scars he bore, both seen and unseen. But Samuel had learned the details over time, piecing together stories from old letters, fragmented conversations, and the occasional comment from one of James's fellow veterans. The battles James had fought in Vietnam were the stuff of nightmares, but they were also the forge in which his unwavering strength had been tempered. And yet, no matter how hard he had fought for his country, time and time again James had been forced to fight a different kind of battle at home. Even now, all these years later, it seemed some things hadn't changed. "You sure you're okay, Dad?" Samuel asked again as they reached the truck. He hated the idea of leaving the question unanswered, of leaving the moment unacknowledged. James paused, gripping his cane as he looked up at his son with an expression that held too many emotions to name. "I'm okay, son," he said finally. But you know as well as I do that this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it probably won't be the last. Samuel clenched his fists unconsciously, his jaw tightening. He wanted to tell his father that things would get better, that the world wasn't all bad. But those words felt shallow, even to him. He knew better than anyone that the fight didn't end when the battle was over. It just changed forms. "Yeah," Samuel said quietly, not trusting himself to say more without the anger rising to his voice. For a moment, the two of them stood there, father and son, each lost in his own thoughts. James patted Samuel on the arm gently before climbing into the truck. Samuel lingered outside for a moment longer, staring into the distance as if searching for something, just out of reach. Then, with a deep breath, he climbed into the passenger seat, his mind already turning over the next steps. Whatever came next, he would make sure his father wasn't facing it alone.